The silence in the courtroom felt like a living thing, pressing down on every soul present with the weight of unspoken truths. Detective Sarah Chen sat rigid in the witness stand, her weathered hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Across the room, Marcus Wheeler, the man accused of abducting 4 children from Millbrook Elementary, stared at her with eyes that seemed to bore straight through her soul. But it wasn't Wheeler's gaze that made her skin crawl. It was the empty space beside her feet where Zeus should have been. For 8 years, the German Shepherd had never left her side during testimony. Never. Through drug busts, murder trials, and missing person cases that had torn communities apart, Zeus had been her constant companion, her living lie detector, her anchor in storms of human cruelty that would have broken lesser souls. Today, for the first time since they'd been partnered, Zeus sat at the back of the courtroom, his massive frame trembling with an energy Sarah had never seen before. His dark eyes weren't focused on Wheeler. They weren't focused on the judge, the jury, or even Sarah herself. Instead, they were locked on someone in the gallery, someone Sarah couldn't quite make out through the sea of faces. "Detective Chen," District Attorney Rebecca Morrison's voice cut through the thick air. "Can you tell the court about the search of Mr. Wheeler's property on October 15th? Sarah's throat felt like sandpaper. The property, the barn, the emptiness. They'd found there that had haunted her dreams for 3 months. "We conducted a thorough search of the defendant's farmland at 1247 Old Creek Road. The search lasted approximately 14 hours and covered the main house, 3 outbuildings, and 47 acres of wooded terrain. And what did you find? Nothing." The word came out as a whisper, and Sarah had to clear her throat to repeat it. "We found nothing related to the missing children." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Sarah could feel the weight of disappointed hopes, of parents who had trusted law enforcement to bring their babies home. Emma Rodriguez, age 7. Tommy Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, age 8. The Mitchell twins, Lucy and Logan, both 9 years old. 4 bright lights extinguished from their community, and after months of investigation, they had nothing but circumstantial evidence and a suspect who maintained his innocence with the conviction of a man telling the truth. From the back of the courtroom came a sound that made Sarah's blood run cold, a low, throaty whine that she'd only heard Zeus make twice before. Once when they'd found the body of a murdered child buried in a shallow grave. Once when they'd discovered a human trafficking ring operating out of a seemingly innocent daycare center. Both times, Zeus had been trying to tell her something she wasn't ready to hear. Judge Patricia Holloway's gavel struck the bench with the finality of a coffin nail. "We'll recess for 15 minutes. Detective Chen, please control your animal." But as Sarah rose from the witness stand, Zeus suddenly erupted into motion. His powerful legs propelled him down the center aisle of the courtroom, past shocked spectators and court officers reaching for their weapons. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched her partner, her loyal, disciplined, never disobedient partner, charge directly toward a figure in the 3rd row. An elderly man with silver hair and kind eyes, a man wearing a volunteer firefighter's pin on his lapel, a man Sarah recognized as Harold Finch, the retired teacher who had organized search parties for the missing children, who had brought coffee and sandwiches to exhausted officers, who had held sobbing parents when hope seemed lost. Zeus skidded to a halt 3 feet from Harold Finch and began to bark, not the controlled alert bark of a trained police dog, but something primal and desperate. Something that sounded almost human in its anguish. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Bailiffs converged on Zeus while Harold Finch sat frozen, his face drained of all color. Sarah pushed through the crowd, her police training warring with an inexplicable dread that was rising in her chest like floodwater. "Zeus, heel," she commanded, but for the first time in their partnership, her dog ignored her completely. Instead, Zeus did something that would haunt Sarah's dreams for the rest of her life. He looked directly into Harold Finch's eyes and howled, a sound so filled with grief and accusation that it seemed to contain the voices of 4 missing children crying out from whatever darkness had claimed them. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the howling stopped. Zeus sat perfectly still, his gaze never wavering from the old man's face, waiting for something only he seemed to understand. Harold Finch's lips moved, but no sound came out, and in that moment of terrible silence, Sarah realized that everything they thought they knew about the case was wrong. 3 years earlier, the bomb had gone off at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, tearing through the meth lab hidden in the basement of what intelligence had believed was an abandoned warehouse. Sarah remembered the exact time because she'd been staring at her watch, counting down the seconds until the warrant would be executed, when the world exploded into fire and screaming metal. She should have died that night, would have died if not for the 80-pound missile of fur and muscle that had slammed into her chest, driving her behind a concrete barrier just as the blast wave turned the air where she'd been standing into a hurricane of deadly shrapnel. Zeus had found her in the rubble 20 minutes later, when the smoke had cleared enough for the search and rescue teams to begin their work. She'd been unconscious, bleeding from a dozen cuts, her left arm bent at an angle that made the paramedics wince. But she was alive, because a dog she'd known for less than 6 months had valued her life more than his own safety. That was the night their partnership had transformed from professional necessity to something deeper, something that transcended the boundaries between human and animal, between handler and canine, between two souls who had found in each other the loyalty that the rest of the world seemed to have forgotten. Zeus had come to her from the ruins of another handler's career. Officer Jake Morrison had been Zeus's original partner, a 15-year veteran who'd been forced into early retirement after a bullet to the spine during a routine traffic stop had left him paralyzed from the waist down. The department had wanted to retire Zeus too. At 5 years old, he was considered too set in his ways to adapt to a new handler. Sarah had volunteered anyway. She'd been working solo for 2 years after losing her previous partner, Rex, to cancer, and the solitude was eating her alive. Police work, she'd learned, wasn't meant to be done alone. It was a profession that demanded trust, communication, and the kind of unspoken understanding that could mean the difference between life and death in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The first month with Zeus had been a disaster. He'd ignored her commands, refused her food, and spent most of his time staring out the kennel window as if waiting for Jake to return. Sarah had been ready to give up, to let the department transfer Zeus to another handler, or retire him to civilian life, when she'd made a discovery that changed everything. She'd been working late, reviewing case files in the department's break room, when she'd heard Zeus whimpering in his kennel. It wasn't the usual sound of a dog dreaming. It was the broken, desperate sound of grief given voice. When she'd gone to check on him, she'd found him lying with his head pressed against a photograph that someone had tucked into the corner of his kennel. The photograph showed Jake Morrison in his dress uniform, receiving a commendation for bravery. Zeus was beside him, proud and alert, wearing the kind of expression that dogs get when they know they're exactly where they belong. That night, Sarah had done something that probably violated a dozen department regulations. She'd taken Zeus home with her, not to her apartment, but to the small house she'd inherited from her grandmother in the hills outside town. She'd let him out into the fenced yard and watched as he'd spent 20 minutes sniffing every corner, every tree, every blade of grass, as if cataloguing the scents of a new world. Then she'd sat on the back porch steps and started talking. Not the official handler to canine commands they'd been practicing, but the kind of conversation she'd never had with another living being. She told Zeus about Rex, about the day the vet had called to say the cancer had spread too far for surgery. She told him about her own fears, the nightmares that woke her at 3 a.m., the hypervigilance that made her jump at every unexpected sound, the way she'd started taking different routes to work, because she was afraid someone might be following her. She'd told him about Jake Morrison, about the visit she'd made to his house after volunteering to take Zeus, about how Jake had looked when he'd signed the transfer papers, like a man giving away the last piece of his heart. And Zeus had listened. Not with the polite attention of a well-trained animal, but with the focused intensity of someone who understood exactly what she was saying. When she'd finished talking, he'd walked over and laid his massive head on her lap, and Sarah had felt something shift in the space between them. The next morning, Zeus had followed her commands flawlessly. Not because he'd suddenly decided to submit to her authority, But because they'd found something more valuable than obedience, they'd found trust. The warehouse explosion had sealed that trust in blood and fire. But it was the case that followed, the disappearance of 3-year-old Amy Winters from her bedroom in the middle of the night, that had revealed the true depth of Zeus's gifts. The trail had gone cold after 48 hours. No witnesses, no physical evidence, no leads that didn't dissolve under scrutiny. Amy's parents had been cleared by polygraph, her neighbors had solid alibis, and the registered sex offenders in the area had all accounted for their whereabouts during the window of the abduction. Sarah and Zeus had been conducting a final sweep of the woods behind the Winters house when Zeus had suddenly broken from the search pattern and bolted toward a section of forest that had already been cleared by 3 other K9 teams. Sarah had called for him to return, but Zeus had been deaf to everything except whatever scent had captured his attention. She'd found him 30 yards off the main trail, digging frantically at what appeared to be a patch of ordinary forest floor. But when Sarah had knelt beside him and brushed away the layer of leaves and debris, she'd uncovered the corner of a small pink blanket. Amy Winters had been buried alive in a makeshift coffin constructed from plywood and PVC pipe. She'd been unconscious but breathing when they'd pulled her from the ground, and she'd made a full recovery after 3 days in the hospital. The man who'd taken her, a drifter with no connection to the family, had confessed within hours of his arrest, unable to understand how the police had found a hiding place he'd been certain was perfect. Sarah had never told anyone about the moment when she'd first seen Zeus digging at that seemingly random spot in the forest, how he'd looked back at her with an expression that seemed almost human in its urgency, how she'd felt, in that instant, that Zeus hadn't just found Amy Winters. By following his nose, he'd found her by following something deeper, something that connected him to the suffering of innocence in a way that transcended normal canine instincts. That was 18 months ago. Since then, Zeus had been responsible for solving 6 major cases, finding evidence that human investigators had missed, and developing a reputation among the department as something more than just a highly trained animal. Other officers had started requesting Zeus for their most difficult cases, and Sarah had begun to notice that her partner seemed to approach each investigation with an intensity that went beyond professional duty. It was as if Zeus understood, on some fundamental level, that his purpose in life was to be a voice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. Now, standing in the chaos of the courtroom, watching Zeus focus every fiber of his being on Harold Finch, Sarah realized that her partner was trying to tell her something that might be more important than anything he'd ever communicated before. The question was whether she was ready to hear it. The 15-minute recess stretched into an hour as courthouse security struggled to restore order. Sarah found herself in the hallway outside the courtroom, Zeus pressed against her legs, his body still vibrating with tension. Every few seconds, he would turn his head toward the courtroom doors, and the low rumble that emanated from his chest made it clear that whatever had triggered his reaction was far from resolved. Detective Chen. The voice belonged to Captain Rodriguez, Sarah's supervisor and the father of one of the missing children. His face looked like it had aged a decade in the past 3 months, and his eyes carried the particular exhaustion that came from hope deferred too many times. What the hell was that about? Sarah looked down at Zeus, who was now staring at a point down the hallway where Harold Finch stood, surrounded by concerned community members. The old man was accepting pats on the shoulder and reassuring words from people who seemed to view Zeus's reaction as nothing more than an unfortunate outburst from an overworked police dog. I don't know, Cap. Zeus has never done anything like that before. Well, he can't do it again. Judge Holloway is considering a mistrial, and Morrison is talking about requesting Zeus be banned from the courthouse entirely. Captain Rodriguez ran his hands through his graying hair. We've got one shot at Wheeler, Sarah. One. If this case falls apart because your dog can't control himself, he's not out of control. The words came out sharper than Sarah had intended, and she softened her tone. Zeus doesn't make mistakes, Cap. You know that. In 3 years, he's never given a false alert, never led us down the wrong path. If he's reacting to Harold Finch, there's a reason. Captain Rodriguez followed her gaze to where Finch was now shaking hands with Reverend Williams from the Baptist Church. Harold Finch has been a pillar of this community for 40 years. He taught half the kids in this town, including my Emma. He organized the search parties for Christ's sake. He's been at the station every day asking how he can help. I know. All that, but Zeus is a dog, Sarah, a very good dog, but still a dog. He's probably picking up some scent from the search parties. You said yourself that Finch has been all over Wheeler's property looking for the kids. Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to explain that Zeus's reaction had been unlike anything she'd seen in their partnership, but she could see in her captain's eyes the desperate need to believe that they were on the right track, that Marcus Wheeler was guilty, and Harold Finch was exactly what he appeared to be, a grieving community member trying to help find 4 missing children. The courtroom doors opened, and bailiff Tom Murphy emerged, his expression grim. "Judge wants to see you, detective, and she wants the dog out of the building." As they walked back into the courtroom, Sarah noticed that Harold Finch had chosen a different seat, this time in the back row, as far from the witness stand as possible. But Zeus's attention found him immediately, and the tension in the dog's body ratcheted up another notch. Judge Holloway looked like she'd spent the recess contemplating the various ways this trial could go wrong. "Detective Chen, I understand that K9 Zeus has an exemplary service record. However, his outburst today was completely unacceptable. I'm ordering that he be removed from the courthouse for the remainder of these proceedings. Your Honor, Zeus is crucial to—" "Detective, this is not a negotiation. Bailiff Murphy will escort you and your partner to the parking lot. When you return to complete your testimony, you will return alone." As Tom Murphy led them toward the exit, Sarah caught sight of Harold Finch watching them go. For just a moment their eyes met, and Sarah saw something flicker across the old man's face. Relief, perhaps, or satisfaction. It was gone so quickly she might have imagined it, but Zeus's reaction was unmistakable. He pulled against his lead, trying to turn back toward Finch, his claws scrabbling against the polished courthouse floor. Outside, the October air was crisp and clean, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the courtroom. Sarah walked Zeus to her patrol car and opened the back door, but instead of jumping in as he normally would, Zeus sat down and stared back at the courthouse entrance. "What is it, buddy?" Sarah knelt beside him, running her fingers through his thick coat. "What did you see in there?" Zeus turned to look at her, and for the 1,000th time in their partnership, Sarah wished she could read the thoughts behind those intelligent brown eyes. But there was something in his expression that she'd never seen before, a kind of desperate urgency that made her chest tighten with anxiety. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Officer Lisa Park, who had been working the Wheeler case from the beginning. "Sarah, can you meet me at the evidence locker when you're done at court? Found something weird in the files." Sarah typed back, "On my way." 20 minutes later, she was standing in the basement evidence room of the police station, watching Lisa pull a banker's box from one of the storage shelves. Zeus had followed them. Downstairs, despite regulations that generally kept K9s out of the evidence area, but given his behavior at the courthouse, Sarah didn't have the heart to leave him alone. "Look at this," Lisa said, spreading a collection of photographs across the table. "These are crime scene photos from Wheeler's property. I've been through them 100 times, but I decided to take another look after today's testimony." Sarah studied the images: Wheeler's farmhouse, the barn, the various outbuildings, the wooded area where they'd concentrated their search efforts. Everything looked exactly as she remembered it: empty, unremarkable, devoid of any trace of the missing children. "What am I supposed to be seeing?" "That's just it. Look at photo 47B. Lisa handed her a close-up shot of the barn's interior. "See that disturbed dirt in the corner? We noted it in the initial report but didn't think much of it. Could have been from farm equipment, animals, whatever." Sarah examined the photo more closely. There was indeed a patch of earth that looked different from the surrounding floor, darker, more recently turned. "We checked this area, didn't we?" "That's what I thought too. But look at this." Lisa pulled out another photograph, this one clearly taken from a different angle. "This is photo 47C, taken about 10 minutes later during the same search. Notice anything different?" Sarah compared the two images, and her blood began to run cold. In the second photograph, the disturbed earth looked exactly the same as the surrounding floor. Undisturbed. as if someone had carefully smoothed it over during the brief window between photographs. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered. "There were officers in that barn the entire time." That's what I thought too, until I checked the search logs. Lisa pulled out a clipboard thick with documentation. Between 2:47 p.m. and 2:58 p.m. on October 15th, there's an 11-minute gap where no officers were assigned to the barn. Everyone was called to assist with the expansion of the search perimeter into the woods. Who suggested expanding the search? Lisa flipped through several pages before finding the right entry. Harold Finch. He told Sergeant Williams that he'd seen something suspicious near the tree line. Turned out to be nothing, but it pulled everyone away from the buildings for almost 15 minutes. Sarah felt Zeus press against her leg, and when she looked down, she saw that he was staring at the photographs with the same intensity he'd shown in the courtroom. His whole body was tense, as if he was trying to communicate something that words couldn't convey. "Lisa, I need you to do something for me. Check Finch's background again. Not just the basic criminal history check, I mean everything. Employment records, addresses, known associates. Go back as far as you can." "You really think Zeus was right about him?" Sarah looked back at the photographs, at the impossible difference between two images taken minutes apart, at the 11-minute window when someone could have concealed evidence, while the entire search team was chasing shadows in the woods. "I think Zeus is trying to tell us something we missed the first time around, and I think we need to listen." As they gathered up the photographs, Zeus suddenly lifted his head and began to whine. Not the desperate sound he'd made in the courtroom, but something softer and more mournful. It was the sound he made when they visited the cemetery where Rex was buried, or when they drove past the house where Amy Winters used to live before her family moved away to start fresh somewhere new. It was the sound Zeus made when he was thinking about children who were lost. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table. Zeus stretched out beside her chair as she spread Lisa's research across the worn wooden surface. Harold Finch's life was laid out in documents and photographs spanning 6 decades. Birth certificate, school records, marriage license, employment history, community service awards, and dozens of newspaper clippings celebrating his contributions to the town of Millbrook. On paper, Harold Finch was exactly what he appeared to be: a model citizen, a dedicated educator, a pillar of the community. He'd taught 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary for 37 years before retiring in 2018. He'd been married to his wife Margaret for 43 years until her death from cancer in 2019. He'd volunteered for the fire department, coached Little League Baseball, organized charity drives, and served on the school board for 12 years. But as Sarah studied the timeline of his life, something began to nag at her, a pattern that was almost too subtle to notice. "Look at this, Zeus." She pulled out a newspaper clipping from 1987, yellowed with age. "Harold Finch receives Teacher of the Year award for his work with at-risk students." She set it aside and found another clipping from 1993. "Local teacher helps troubled children through after-school mentoring program." Zeus raised his head, watching as Sarah arranged the clippings in chronological order. There were dozens of them, spanning 3 decades, all celebrating Harold Finch's special dedication to children who were struggling, children from broken homes, children with behavioral problems, children who needed extra attention and care. Sarah reached for her laptop and began cross-referencing the dates. What she found made her hands shake. In 1989, 2 years after Harold's first Teacher of the Year award, 7-year-old Michael Torres had disappeared while walking home from school. The case had never been solved. Michael had been one of Harold's special students, a child from a troubled home who had been staying after school for extra help. In 1995, 10-year-old Ashley Coleman had vanished from a school carnival. She'd been seen talking to an adult near the parking lot, but witnesses' descriptions were vague and conflicting. Ashley had also been in Harold's mentoring program, a quiet girl who'd been struggling with her parents' recent divorce. In 2001, twin brothers David and Daniel Kim had disappeared from a summer camp where Harold Finch was volunteering as a counselor. The boys had been found 3 days later, wandering in the woods with no memory of where they'd been. They'd both required extensive therapy afterward, and their family had moved away from Millbrook within a month. Sarah pulled up missing children databases, expanding her search to include neighboring counties and states. The pattern that emerged made her stomach clench with horror. Over the past 30 years, within a 100-mile radius of Harold Finch's various residences and volunteer positions, 17 children had disappeared or gone missing temporarily. Not all of them had been found. Not all of them had survived, and every single one of them had some connection to Harold Finch. Sarah's phone rang, making her jump. The caller ID showed Lisa Park's number. "Sarah, you need to hear this. I've been going through Finch's employment records, and I found something weird. He took extended sick leave 3 times during his teaching career. Want to guess when?" Sarah looked at her timeline. 1989, 1995, and 2001. "How did you—" "Never mind. Yes, exactly those years. Each time he was out for 2 to 3 months with what his doctor described as nervous exhaustion. But here's the really weird part. I talked to his former principal, Mrs. Henderson. She's 92 and sharp as a tack. She remembers Harold taking those leaves, but she said he never seemed sick to her. If anything, she said he seemed energized, happy almost, like he was looking forward to his time off." Sarah looked down at Zeus, who had been listening to the phone conversation with the focused attention he usually reserved for suspect interviews. "Lisa, I need you to check something else. Look up property records for Harold Finch. Not just his primary residence, everything. Rental properties, family land, anything he might have access to. Already on it. Give me an hour." After Lisa hung up, Sarah sat in the silence of her kitchen, staring at the evidence spread before her. Outside, night was falling over the hills, surrounding her house, and the first stars were becoming visible through the window above her sink. Zeus rose from his spot beside her chair and walked to the window, his nose pressed against the glass. After a moment, he began to whine. Not the mournful sound from earlier, but something more urgent. Sarah joined him at the window and followed his gaze across the valley below. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, she could see the lights of Harold Finch's house, the same house where, according to the property records Lisa had uncovered, Harold had been living alone since his wife's death. The same house that sat on 12 acres of wooded land, with several outbuildings and a root cellar that predated the main structure by decades. The same house that was less than 3 miles from the Wheeler property where they'd searched so thoroughly for 4 missing children. Sarah's phone buzzed with another text from Lisa. Found something big. Harold inherited a second property from his uncle in 1988. Old farm with multiple structures. Want to guess where it's located? Sarah didn't need to guess. She could feel the truth settling into her bones like ice water, confirming what Zeus had been trying to tell her all along. They'd been looking in the wrong place. As she reached for her car keys, Zeus was already at the front door, his tail wagging for the first time since the courtroom incident. But this wasn't the happy wag of a Basim dog anticipating a walk or a game of fetch. This was the focused, determined movement of a working dog who finally understood his mission. Sarah clipped Zeus's lead to his collar and looked into his intelligent brown eyes. "You've been trying to tell me, haven't you, buddy? All this time, you've been trying to tell me where they are." Zeus's response was a single sharp bark that sounded remarkably like agreement. They were going to find the children. But first, they were going to have to prove that the man who'd been helping to search for them was the same man who'd taken them in the first place. Sarah grabbed her service weapon, her radio, and her cell phone. Then she and Zeus walked out into the night, toward whatever truth was waiting for them in the darkness. As they drove through the winding country roads that led toward Harold Finch's inherited property, Sarah found herself thinking about trust, about the way Zeus had trusted her enough to defy protocol in the courtroom, about the way she was now trusting him enough to follow his instincts into what might be the most important case of their careers. Behind them, Millbrook settled into evening, quiet, its residents unaware that their most trusted neighbor might be their greatest nightmare. Ahead of them, somewhere in the darkness, 4 children were waiting to be found. And between Sarah and those children stood Harold Finch, a man who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of hiding in plain sight, earning the trust of the very community whose children he was stealing. But Harold Finch had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the bond between a police officer and her canine partner. He'd underestimated Zeus's ability to sense the truth that human minds were too willing to dismiss. Most importantly, he'd underestimated what would happen when that truth finally came to light. The Finch property sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through dense forest for nearly 2 miles before opening into a small clearing. Sarah had called for backup before making the turn onto the private drive, but she'd requested silent approach. No sirens, no flashing lights, nothing that might alert Harold to their presence if he was indeed at the property. The main house was dark, which wasn't surprising given that it was nearly 10 p.m., but as Sarah and Zeus approached on foot, leaving the patrol car hidden behind a cluster of pine trees, she could see light coming from one of the outbuildings, a structure that looked like it might have been a workshop or storage shed at some point in its history. Zeus was moving differently now, with the controlled intensity of a dog who had found his quarry. He stayed close to Sarah's side, but she could feel the coiled energy in his muscles, the way his head moved constantly as he processed scents and sounds that were beyond her human perception. They were 50 yards from the lit building when Zeus suddenly froze, his body going rigid with attention. Sarah stopped immediately, following his gaze toward a section of forest to their left. For a long moment, she saw nothing. Then movement caught her eye. A figure walking through the trees carrying what appeared to be a flashlight. Harold Finch emerged from the tree line, moving with the careful gait of a man trying not to make noise. He was carrying something in addition to the flashlight, a small cooler and what looked like a bundle of clothing. As he approached the lit building, Sarah could see his face clearly in the glow from the windows. He looked nothing like the kindly retired teacher who had comforted grieving parents and organized search parties. His expression was focused, purposeful, almost businesslike. This was a man going about a routine task, something he'd done many times before. Sarah reached for her radio to call for immediate backup, but Zeus's sudden movement stopped her. Her partner had spotted something she'd missed, a second figure moving near the main house. Someone was approaching from the opposite direction, someone who hadn't yet seen Harold or been seen by him. The second figure resolved into Captain Rodriguez, moving with the tactical awareness of a veteran officer. He must have decided to follow up on Sarah's investigation, probably concerned about her safety, when she'd left the station without officially checking out for the night. The three of them, Sarah, Harold, and Captain Rodriguez, were now positioned in a rough triangle around the lit building, with Zeus the only one aware of everyone's positions. Sarah needed to warn Rodriguez about Harold's presence without alerting Harold to either of their locations. She was reaching for her radio again when Zeus made the decision for all of them. Without warning, he bolted from Sarah's side, racing directly toward Harold Finch with the focused determination of a missile seeking its target. Sarah's whispered command to heel went ignored. Zeus was operating on instincts that transcended training, following imperatives that came from deeper than obedience. Harold spun around at the sound of Zeus's approach, the flashlight and cooler falling from his hands as he stumbled backward. In the harsh glare of the dropped flashlight, Sarah could see his face clearly, and what she saw there confirmed every suspicion Zeus had been trying to communicate: fear, guilt, and the desperate calculation of a man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. "Get away from me!" Harold shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Get that dog away from me!" Zeus didn't attack. Instead, he positioned himself between Harold and the lit building, his body language making it clear that Harold would not be allowed to pass. The growl that emanated from Zeus's chest was unlike anything Sarah had heard from him before. It contained decades of accumulated rage at the suffering of innocents, the voice of every victim who had never been able to speak for themselves. Captain Rodriguez emerged from the shadows near the main house, his weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. "Harold, what's going on here?" "Captain." Harold's voice took on the pleading tone of a man grasping for the familiar comfort of authority. "Thank God you're here. This dog attacked me. I was just checking on my property, and it came out of nowhere." But even as Harold spoke, Sarah could see that Captain Rodriguez's attention had shifted to the lit building behind Zeus. Through the windows, shapes were visible. Furniture, equipment, and something else that made Rodriguez's face go pale in the Flashlights glow, small beds, 4 of them, arranged in a row like a makeshift dormitory. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez whispered, and his service weapon came up to a ready position. "Harold, I need you to step away from the building, now." "I don't understand what's happening." "Here," Harold said, but his voice lacked conviction. "This is my property. I have every right to—" His words were cut off by a sound that made Sarah's heart stop. From inside the building came the muffled sound of children's voices, not crying or screaming, but talking quietly among themselves, in the way children do when they're trying to be brave in the face of something they don't understand. Emma Rodriguez, Tommy Chen, Lucy and Logan Mitchell, 4 voices that their families had feared they might never hear again. Zeus's growl intensified, and he took a step closer to Harold, who was now backing toward the tree line. Sarah could see in the dog's posture that Zeus was preparing to give chase if Harold tried to run. But she could also see something else in Zeus's body language, a protective instinct that was focused not on Harold, but on the building behind them. Zeus wasn't just preventing Harold from escaping. He was guarding the children. "Don't move, Harold." Captain Rodriguez's voice carried the absolute authority of 25 years in law enforcement. "Sarah, call this in. I want every available unit out here now, plus paramedics and social services." As Sarah reached for her radio, Harold made his desperate play. "You don't understand. This isn't what it looks like. I was protecting them. Wheeler was going to hurt them, and I couldn't let that happen. I was keeping them safe until what?" Rodriguez's voice was deadly quiet. "Until you decided what to do with them. Like you did with Michael Torres in 1989. Like you did with Ashley Coleman in 1995. Harold's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like exactly what he was, a tired old man whose decades of carefully hidden monstrosity had finally been exposed. But then his expression hardened, and Sarah saw the cold calculation that had allowed him to prey on children for 30 years while maintaining the facade of a beloved community figure. "You can't prove anything," he said. "It's my word against—" "What, the behavior of a dog? No jury will convict me based on—" Zeus's bark cut through Harold's words like a gunshot. But this wasn't the desperate howl from the courtroom or the protective growl from moments before. This was the sharp, commanding bark of a police dog who had found exactly what he'd been searching for. Without waiting for Sarah's command, Zeus trotted to a spot near the corner of the Zeus's purposeful movement toward the corner of the building, drew everyone's attention like a magnet. The German shepherd stopped at what appeared to be an unremarkable patch of ground and began to dig with the same desperate intensity Sarah had witnessed when he'd found Amy Winters buried in the forest. "Zeus, what is it?" Sarah moved closer, her flashlight beam joining Captain Rodriguez's to illuminate the area where her partner was frantically clawing at the earth. Harold Finch had gone completely still, his face drained of all color as he watched Zeus work. "No," he whispered, and the word carried the weight of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse. "No, you can't. They won't understand." Within minutes, Zeus had uncovered something that made Sarah's stomach lurch with horror and rage. It was a small metal box, the kind used for storing documents or valuables. But this box contained something far more sinister: photographs, dozens of them, showing children in various states of distress and captivity. Captain Rodriguez knelt beside the box, his hands shaking as he examined the contents with the beam of his flashlight. "Jesus Christ, Harold, how long? How many children?" "You don't understand," Harold's voice cracked with desperation. "I never hurt them. I loved them. They were special, chosen. I was saving them from a world that would have broken them, corrupted them." Sarah felt Zeus press against her leg, and when she looked down she saw that her partner was staring at Harold with an expression of pure contempt. It was as if Zeus understood, on some fundamental level, the magnitude of Harold's delusions and the depth of his crimes. From inside the building, the children's voices had grown louder, as if they sensed that something was happening outside. Sarah could hear Emma Rodriguez calling for her daddy, and the sound nearly broke her heart. "We need to get to those kids," she said, moving toward the building's door. "Wait." Captain Rodriguez held up a hand. "We don't know what kind of security measures he might have in place." Harold, are there any traps, any dangers the children might face if we go in there wrong? Harold's laugh was bitter and broken. Traps? You think I'm some kind of monster? I built that place to keep them safe, comfortable, everything they needed, books, games, proper beds, healthy food. I gave them a better life than they ever would have had with their broken families. You kidnapped them. Rodriguez's voice thundered across the clearing. You stole them from their parents. Emma is 7 years old, Harold, 7. She's been crying for her mother every night for 3 months. She'll get over it, they always do. Children are resilient, adaptable. They learn to appreciate what I've given them. Harold's voice had taken on the tone of a man reciting a deeply held belief, something he'd told himself so many times. It had become gospel. The others did. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The others? How many others, Harold? Harold's eyes took on a distant quality, as if he was looking back through decades of carefully curated memories. Michael was the first. Such a sweet boy, so hungry. For attention. His parents were drug addicts, you know. They barely noticed when he didn't come home from school. He lived with me for 3 wonderful months before... Before what? Rodriguez's voice was deadly quiet. Before he got sick. Pneumonia. I couldn't take him to a hospital, couldn't risk exposure. I did everything I could, but... Harold's voice trailed off, and for a moment his face showed genuine grief. I buried him in the forest behind my house, gave him a proper funeral, said words over his grave. He was at peace. Sarah's hands were shaking as she processed the full scope of Harold's crimes. Ashley Coleman? The Kim twins? Ashley was different. She fought me constantly, tried to escape. After 6 months, I realized she would never adapt, never appreciate what I was offering her. So I let her go. Took her to a truck stop 3 states away and left her there. She was found eventually, but she'd been traumatized by her experience with me. She told stories about a man who kept her in a basement, but she could never identify me. The trauma had affected her memory. And the Kim twins, Harold's expression softened slightly. David and Daniel were perfect for 3 beautiful days. They understood what I was offering them, a life free from the chaos of their parents' failing marriage, a place where they could be cherished and protected. But then David had an asthma attack, and I realized I couldn't provide the medical care they needed. I had no choice but to return them to the woods near their camp. Sarah looked at Zeus, who had been listening to Harold's confession with the focused attention of a witness bearing testimony. Her partner's body language had changed subtly. He was no longer poised for action, but seemed instead to be absorbing every word, as if understanding that this moment would define the rest of their partnership. The children in there now, Rodriguez said, nodding toward the building. How long have you had them? Emma came to me first 3 months ago. She was walking home from school crying because some older boys had been teasing her. I offered her a ride, told her I knew her father, that he'd asked me to pick her up. She trusted me. Harold's voice carried a note of pride that made Sarah's skin crawl. The others followed over the next few weeks. Tommy was easy. He was always staying late at school, waiting for his working mother to pick him up. The Mitchell twins were at the park alone while their babysitter was distracted by her phone. "You son of a bitch," Rodriguez whispered, and Sarah could see him struggling to maintain professional composure in the face of every parent's worst nightmare. Harold seemed oblivious to Rodriguez's rage. "I've been planning this for years, ever since Margaret died. She never understood my special connection with children, never supported my calling. After she passed, I finally felt free to create the perfect sanctuary. Those 4 children have everything they need: education, entertainment, proper nutrition, safety. They're better off with me than they ever were with their neglectful families." Zeus suddenly lifted his head and began to whine, not with distress, but with what sounded almost like impatience. Sarah followed his gaze and realized that her partner was looking toward the building where the children were being held. "They know we're here," she said, understanding flooding through her. Zeus can sense their emotional state. They're scared, but they're also hopeful. They know something's happening. As if summoned by her words, Emma Rodriguez's voice called out from inside the building. "Is someone out there? Please help us. We want to go home." The sound of his daughter's voice broke something fundamental in Captain Rodriguez. His weapon swung toward Harold with deadly intent, and Sarah could see in his eyes the moment when the professional law enforcement officer gave way to the father whose child had been stolen. "Give me one reason," Rodriguez said, his voice barely controlled. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't end this right now." Harold backed away, his hands raised in surrender, but there was nowhere for him to go. Zeus had positioned himself to cut off any escape route to the forest, and Sarah had moved to block the path back to the main house. "Please," Harold begged. "You have to understand, I never hurt them, I loved them. Everything I did was out of love." "Love?" Sarah's voice cut through the night air like a blade. "You call terrorizing 4 families for 3 months love. You call stealing children from their parents and keeping them imprisoned love. They're not imprisoned." Harold's voice rose to a near shout. "They have books, games, a television. They eat better food than they ever had at home. I read to them every night, help them with their schoolwork, give them the attention their own parents never—" His words were cut off by Zeus's bark. Not the aggressive challenge from earlier, but something that sounded almost like disgust. Sarah had never heard her partner make such a sound, but it perfectly captured her own reaction to Harold's twisted justifications. From inside the building came the sound of small fists pounding on what must have been a reinforced door. "Please!" Tommy Chen's voice joined Emma's. "We know you're out there. Please help us." Sarah looked at Captain Rodriguez, whose face was streaming with tears as he listened to his daughter's pleas. The time for careful tactical approaches had passed. Those children had been imprisoned for 3 months, and every second they remained captive was a second too long. "Harold," she said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of 8 years as a police officer and 3 years as Zeus's. "Partner, you're going to unlock that door right now. You're going to let those children walk out of there and into their parents' arms. And then you're going to spend the rest of your miserable life in prison thinking about what you've done." Harold shook his head frantically. "You don't understand what you're asking. If you take them away from me, they'll be lost. They need structure, guidance, protection. Their families don't appreciate them the way I do." Zeus's response was to walk directly to Harold and sit down in front of him, staring up into the old man's face with an expression that needed no translation. It was the look of a guardian who had found his purpose, a protector who would not be denied. And in that moment, Harold Finch finally understood that his 30-year reign of terror was over. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the night. As Harold Finch fumbled with a set of keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fit them into the building's heavy-duty lock. Captain Rodriguez stood directly behind him, service weapon drawn and trained on the back of Harold's head, while Sarah positioned herself between Harold and any possible escape route. Zeus had not moved from his position directly in front of Harold, his intense stare never wavering from the old man's face. It was as if the German shepherd understood that this moment, the unlocking of that door, would define whether justice would be served or delayed. "Hurry up!" Rodriguez commanded, his voice thick with the emotional strain of hearing his daughter's voice from behind that locked door. The lock finally clicked open, and Harold stepped back as Rodriguez shouldered past him to push the door wide. What they found inside made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. The building had been converted into a grotesque parody of a child's bedroom. 4 small beds were arranged along one wall, each with colorful blankets and stuffed animals. A table held stacks of children's books and board games. A small television sat on a stand in the corner, surrounded by beanbag chairs. Under different circumstances, it might have looked like a daycare center or a children's playroom, but the bars on the windows and the heavy-duty lock on the door told the real story. This wasn't a playroom. It was a prison designed to look comfortable, enough to ease a kidnapper's conscience. Emma Rodriguez was the first to reach the door, throwing herself into her father's arms with the desperate relief of a child who had given up hope of ever seeing home again. Captain Rodriguez sank to his knees, wrapping his daughter in his arms as tears streamed down his face. "Daddy," Emma sobbed, "I knew you'd find me. I knew you wouldn't give up." Tommy Chen emerged next, followed by the Mitchell twins, all 3. Children moving with the careful hesitation of kids who had learned not to trust too quickly. But when they saw the police uniforms and recognized Sarah from the school safety program she'd presented at their elementary school, Their caution gave way to overwhelming relief. Sarah knelt down to their level, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her professional composure. "You're safe now," she told them. "You're all safe. We're going to take you home to your families." Zeus approached the children slowly, his tail wagging gently, and Sarah watched as Tommy Chen, who had always been shy around dogs, reached out to pet Zeus's head. "He found us, didn't he?" Tommy asked, his young voice filled with wonder. "The police dog found us. Yes," Sarah said, looking back at Zeus with pride and gratitude that went beyond words. "He never stopped looking for you." Behind them, Harold Finch was being secured by the arriving backup officers, but his attention remained fixed on the children who were now free from his control. "You don't understand what you're doing," he called out desperately. "They need me. Their families don't appreciate them the way I do." Emma Rodriguez turned around at the sound of Harold's voice, and for the first time since the nightmare began, Sarah saw anger in the 7-year-old's eyes. "You're a liar," Emma shouted with the righteous fury that only children can summon. "You said our parents didn't want us anymore. You said they forgot about us." "I was protecting you," Harold insisted, even as the handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists. "Your families were broken, neglectful. I gave you structure, education, proper care. You locked us up." Lucy Mitchell stepped forward, her twin brother Logan beside her, both of them holding hands for mutual support. "You wouldn't let us go outside. You wouldn't let us call our mom and dad." Sarah watched Zeus during this exchange, noting how her partner positioned himself between the children and Harold, as if still protecting them from the man who had caused them so much trauma. But there was something else in Zeus's posture, a sense of completion, as if he understood that his mission was finally accomplished. The paramedics arrived next, followed by social workers and victim advocates who would help guide the children through the difficult process of recovery and reunion with their families. As the clearing filled with emergency vehicles and personnel, Sarah found herself standing beside Zeus, both of them watching as 4 families' worst nightmare finally came to an end. "How did you know?" Captain Rodriguez asked, joining Sarah while keeping one protective arm around his daughter. "How did Zeus know to focus on Harold?" Sarah looked down at her partner, who was now sitting calmly beside her, his work for the evening complete. "I think he's been trying to tell us for a while. Dogs can sense things we miss: fear, deception, the lingering sense of places where children have been held against their will. Harold had been all over the Wheeler property during the searches, contaminating it with the scents from this place. Zeus could smell the children on him. But why didn't he alert during any of the previous searches? Because Harold was careful. He never brought anything directly from here to the search sites, but today in the courtroom, Harold must have been nervous about the trial. Maybe he visited the children before coming to court. Maybe he handled something from this building. Zeus picked up on scents that connected Harold directly to the missing kids. As if understanding that he was being discussed, Zeus looked up at Sarah with an expression that seemed remarkably human in its satisfaction. His tail wagged once, briefly, before he returned his attention to the children who were now being evaluated by paramedics. Officer Lisa Park approached with Harold's confession, a rambling, self-justifying document that would provide prosecutors with everything they needed to ensure he spent the rest of his life in prison. "He's admitted to at least 7 kidnappings over the past 30 years, she reported. 3 murders, although he claims they were accidental deaths due to illness or injury. The DA says it's one of the most comprehensive confessions she's ever seen." Sarah nodded, but her attention was focused on the reunion scene playing out before them. Parents who had arrived at the scene were embracing children they had feared they might never see again. The Mitchell twins were wrapped in their mother's arms while their father spoke urgently into his cell phone, probably calling relatives to share the miraculous news. Tommy Chen's mother had arrived and was holding her son as if she might never let him go again. These families would need time to heal, Sarah knew. The children would require counseling to process the trauma of their captivity. The parents would struggle with guilt and anger and the complex emotions that came with having their worst fears realized and then resolved. But they were together again, and that was what mattered most. Zeus suddenly stood up and walked toward Harold Finch, who was now seated in the back of a patrol car awaiting transport to the county jail. The German Shepherd stopped a few feet from the vehicle and stared at Harold through the window with an expression that Sarah had never seen before. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was something more profound, a kind of final judgment that seemed to come from a place deeper than instinct or training. Zeus looked at Harold Finch with the accumulated weight of every victim who had suffered at his hands, every family who had been torn apart by his crimes, every child who had cried themselves to sleep in captivity. Then Zeus turned away, dismissing Harold as completely as if the man had ceased to exist. The old man who had terrorized children for 3 decades had been reduced to irrelevance by the silent judgment of a dog who understood justice in ways that human beings often forgot. 8. Public reaction and fallout. 3 days later, the Millbrook Community Center had never held a crowd like this one. Nearly 500 people packed into the main hall, with dozens more gathered in the parking lot where local news crews had set up their equipment. The story of Harold Finch's arrest and the rescue of 4 kidnapped children had spread far beyond the borders of their small town, drawing national media attention and turning Millbrook into an unlikely symbol of both humanity's capacity for evil and its potential for redemption. Sarah sat on the stage beside Captain Rodriguez, Zeus lying calmly at her feet, despite the overwhelming crowd and cacophony of voices. The German Shepherd had become something of a celebrity over the past 3 days, with reporters asking for interviews and photographers wanting pictures of the hero dog who had solved one of the most disturbing cases in the region's history. But Zeus seemed largely indifferent to the attention. He remained focused on what he'd always been focused on, protecting the innocent and serving justice. The accolades and acclaim meant nothing to him compared to the simple satisfaction of knowing that 4 children were sleeping safely in their own beds. Mayor Patricia Hendricks took the podium, her voice amplified by speakers throughout the hall. We're here today not just to celebrate the rescue of Emma Rodriguez, Tommy Chen, and Lucy and Logan Mitchell, but to acknowledge the courage and dedication of the law enforcement officers who never gave up hope. The crowd erupted in applause, but Sarah noticed that Zeus didn't react to the noise. Instead, his attention was focused on a section of the audience where the rescued children sat with their families. Emma Rodriguez waved at Zeus from her father's lap, and Sarah could swear she saw her partner's tail twitch slightly in acknowledgement. But, most importantly, the mayor continued, we need to acknowledge that we failed these children as a community. Harold Finch was able to operate among us for 30 years because we chose to see only what we wanted to see. We ignored signs, dismissed concerns, and allowed our trust in a familiar face to blind us to the truth. The hall fell silent as the weight of that statement settled over the crowd. Sarah had spent the past 3 days fielding questions from reporters, investigators, and community members who couldn't understand how Harold Finch had managed to hide his crimes for so long. The answer was both simple and terrifying. He'd hidden them by being exactly what people expected a pillar of the community to be. Going forward, Mayor Hendricks said, we're implementing new protocols for anyone who works with children in our community, enhanced background checks, mandatory reporting training, and most importantly, a commitment to listening when children try to tell us they're in danger. Sarah thought about the cases she'd researched, about Michael Torres and Ashley Coleman, and all the other children whose suffering had been dismissed or ignored because Harold Finch was too respected, too trusted, too much a part of the community fabric for anyone to suspect him of wrongdoing. Captain Rodriguez took the podium next, his voice still rough with emotion, when he spoke about his daughter's ordeal. Emma asked me to read something she wrote, he said, pulling out a piece of paper covered in a 7-year-old's careful handwriting. She wanted everyone to know how she felt about what happened. He cleared his throat and began to read. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and I was taken by Mr. Finch for 3 months. He told us our families didn't want us anymore, but that was a lie. He said he loved us, but you don't lock up people you love. The police dog Zeus knew something was wrong, and he helped find us. I want to thank Zeus and Detective Chen and my daddy for never giving up on us, and I want to tell other kids that if someone tries to take you or hurt you, it's not your fault, and people will look for you until they find you. There wasn't a dry eye in the hall as Captain Rodriguez folded the letter and returned to his seat. Sarah felt Zeus shift beside her, and when she looked down she saw that he was looking directly at her, with an expression that seemed to convey understanding and approval. When Sarah was called to the podium, she found herself facing a sea of faces, some tearful, some angry, all of them searching for meaning in a story that challenged everything they thought they knew about their community. "Zeus and I have been partners for 3 years," she began, her hand resting on her service weapon out of habit. "In that time, he's helped solve dozens of cases and find countless pieces of evidence that human investigators missed. But this case was different. This case wasn't about following a scent trail or alerting to hidden drugs. This case was about Zeus understanding something that the rest of us weren't ready to accept." She paused, gathering her thoughts as she looked out at the crowd. Dogs don't lie. They don't make assumptions based on reputation or social standing. They don't dismiss their instincts because someone seems too nice or too respectable to be dangerous. Zeus knew Harold Finch was connected to those missing children because he trusted what his senses were telling him, even when every human in that courtroom was telling him he was wrong. Sarah could see nodding heads throughout the audience, people beginning to understand the deeper implications of what had happened. We need to learn from Zeus's example. We need to trust our instincts when something feels wrong, even if we can't immediately explain why. We need to listen to children when they tell us they're uncomfortable around an adult, even if that adult is someone we trust and respect. And we need to remember that predators don't announce themselves with warning signs. They succeed by being exactly the kind of people we least suspect. As Sarah returned to her seat, she noticed Harold Finch's former colleagues and neighbors in the audience, people who were still struggling to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster who had been revealed. Some of them looked angry, as if they felt personally betrayed by Harold's deception. Others looked guilty, as if wondering whether they had missed signs that might have prevented some of his crimes. The program continued with statements from the district attorney about the charges against Harold Finch: kidnapping, child endangerment, and murder in the first degree for the deaths of Michael Torres and 2 other children, whose remains had been found on his property. There were announcements about counseling services for the rescued children and their families, new safety programs for the schools, and a victims fund that had already raised over $50,000 for the affected families. But Sarah found her attention drifting to Zeus, who had remained calm and focused throughout the entire event. Her partner had become a symbol of justice and perseverance, but she knew that the real victory wasn't the public recognition or the media attention. The real victory was 4 children sleeping safely in their own beds, reunited with families who loved them. As the program concluded and people began to file out of the community center, several families approached the stage to thank Sarah and Zeus personally. The Mitchell twins showed Zeus drawings they'd made of him, complete with a cape and the word hero written in crayon across the top. Tommy Chen's mother brought a homemade dog biscuit shaped like a bone, with "Thank you, Zeus" spelled out in icing, but it was Emma Rodriguez who provided the moment that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. The 7-year-old approached Zeus slowly, respectfully, and knelt down beside him. "Thank you for not giving up on us," she whispered, her small hand gently stroking Zeus's head. "I knew someone would come find us, but I didn't know it would be you." Zeus looked into Emma's eyes with an expression of infinite gentleness, and for just a moment, Sarah could see in her partner's face the soul of every rescue dog, every service animal, every creature who had chosen to dedicate their life to protecting others. Then Zeus did something he'd never done before in all their years of partnership. He gently licked Emma's cheek, not the professional restraint of a working police dog, but the simple affection of one friend comforting another. And in that moment, Sarah understood that Zeus's greatest victory wasn't solving a case or earning public recognition. His greatest victory was giving 4 children their lives back. 9. Emotional resolution. 6 months later, the morning sun filtered through the trees surrounding Sarah's house as she and Zeus walked the familiar trail that wound through the hills behind her property. It had become their ritual, a daily walk that served as both physical exercise and emotional decompression after their shifts at the police department. The past 6 months had brought significant changes to both their professional and personal lives. Harold Finch had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, dying behind bars at the age of 73, just 4 months into his sentence. The official cause was a heart attack, but Sarah suspected that the weight of his crimes and the complete destruction of his carefully constructed facade had simply been too much for his system to bear. The 4 rescued children were all receiving counseling and had shown remarkable resilience in their recovery. Emma Rodriguez had returned to school and was excelling in her studies, though she still insisted on having her father walk her to and from class every day. Tommy Chen had started taking karate lessons, telling his mother that he wanted to be strong enough to protect other kids if someone tried to hurt them. The Mitchell twins had become inseparable, rarely letting each other out of their sight, but their parents reported that they were laughing again, playing again, beginning to trust the world around them. Zeus had received numerous commendations and awards, including a Medal of Valor from the State Police and recognition from the International Association of Chiefs of Police. But Sarah knew that her partner remained essentially unchanged by the acclaim. He was still the same loyal, dedicated, intuitive dog who had saved her life in that warehouse explosion 3 years ago. What had changed was the way other people looked at Zeus and at Sarah herself. They were no longer just another K9 team in a small-town police department. They had become symbols of the kind of police work that made a real difference in people's lives, the kind of partnership that could achieve things that neither human nor animal could accomplish alone. The trail curved around a bend, opening into a small clearing where Sarah often stopped to rest and think. This morning she found someone waiting for them. Captain Rodriguez, who was sitting on a fallen log with his own morning coffee, clearly having anticipated their arrival. "Morning, Sarah." "Morning, Zeus." Rodriguez scratched behind Zeus's ears. As the German Shepherd approached to greet him, "Beautiful day for a walk. You didn't come up here just to comment on the weather, Cap." Sarah settled beside him on the log, Zeus lying down at their feet. "What's on your mind?" Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the valley below where the town of Millbrook was beginning to wake up. "I've been thinking about retirement," he said finally. "Emma's been having nightmares again, and Lisa thinks it would help if I was around more. Less stress, more stability." Sarah nodded, understanding the decision without needing explanation. The past 6 months had taken a toll on all of them, but perhaps most especially on Rodriguez, who had been forced to live with the knowledge that his daughter had been suffering while he'd been focused on the wrong suspect. "The department's going to need a new captain," Rodriguez continued. "The mayor's been asking for my recommendation. Any thoughts on who might be ready for the job?" Rodriguez smiled, looking down at Zeus. "I told her I thought the best candidate was someone who had demonstrated exceptional judgment, strong leadership skills, and the ability to solve cases that other investigators couldn't crack. Someone who trusted their instincts even when conventional wisdom suggested otherwise." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Cap, if you're suggesting what I think you're suggesting, Detective Sarah Chen and K9 Zeus, the new leadership team for the Millbrook Police Department." Rodriguez's smile widened. "Assuming you're interested in the position." Sarah looked down at Zeus, who had lifted his head at the sound of his name. Her partner regarded her with the same intelligent, trusting expression. He'd worn for 3 years, waiting to see what new challenge they would face together. "Zeus and I are a team," she said finally. "Whatever position I take, he takes with me. That's non-negotiable. Wouldn't have it any other way. The department's already approved a new K9 program, with you and Zeus as the founding team. Better facilities, more resources, and a mandate to train other K9 units in the kind of intuitive investigation techniques that broke the Finch case." Sarah felt a surge of excitement and purpose that she hadn't experienced since the night they'd rescued the 4 children. This was more than a promotion. It was an opportunity to build something meaningful, to create a legacy that would help other children and other families facing similar crises. "There's one more thing," Rodriguez said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "This came in the mail yesterday, thought you should see it. He handed Sarah an envelope addressed to Detective Chen and Zeus, Millbrook Police Department. The return address showed it was from Ashley Coleman, the girl Harold Finch had kidnapped in 1995 and released after 6 months of captivity. Sarah opened the envelope carefully, revealing a handwritten letter and a photograph. The photo showed a young woman in a graduation cap and gown, holding a diploma and smiling broadly. The letter was brief but powerful. "Dear Detective Chen and Zeus, I saw the news coverage of Harold Finch's arrest and wanted to thank you for finally bringing him to justice. I've spent 28 years trying to forget what he did to me, but I've never been able to completely move past the trauma of those 6 months. Knowing that he can never hurt another child has given me a kind of peace I didn't think was possible. I'm graduating next month with a degree in social work, specializing in trauma counseling for children. I want to spend my career helping kids who have been through experiences like mine. Please give Zeus an extra treat from me. Dogs understand things about people that humans often miss, and I'm grateful that you trusted his instincts enough to keep looking for the truth. Thank you for giving me closure and giving those 4 children their lives back. Sincerely, Ashley." Coleman-Sarah folded the letter carefully, feeling the weight of connection between past victims and present justice. Harold Finch's crimes had created ripples of trauma that had spread across decades, but those same ripples had ultimately led to his downfall and to the rescue of 4 children who might otherwise have suffered the same fate. "So, what do you say?" Rodriguez asked. "Ready to be Captain Chen?" Sarah looked out at the town below, where families were beginning their daily routines with the security of knowing their children were safe. She thought about Emma Rodriguez's drawing of Zeus in a superhero cape, about Tommy Chen's thank you card, about the Mitchell twins holding hands as they walked into school each morning. She thought about the cases they hadn't solved yet, the children who were still missing, the families who were still waiting for answers. She thought about the responsibility of leadership and the opportunity to build something that would outlast any individual career or partnership. Then she looked down at Zeus, who was watching her with the patient attention of a partner who trusted her judgment completely. "Zeus," she said, "what do you think? Ready to help me run a police department?" Zeus's response was a single sharp bark that sounded remarkably like agreement. Then he stood up, walked to the edge of the clearing, and looked back at them as if to say, "What are we waiting for? We have work to do." Sarah and Rodriguez laughed, the sound echoing across the valley as they prepared to descend back into town and begin the next chapter of their careers. Behind them, the sun climbed higher into the morning sky, casting long shadows that gradually shortened as the day took hold. In 6 months, Zeus had gone from being a police dog following commands to being a partner whose instincts had reshaped an entire community's understanding of justice and protection. He had proven that loyalty, courage, and an unwavering commitment to the innocent could triumph over even the most carefully concealed evil. But for Zeus, none of that mattered as much as the simple fact that he was walking beside Sarah, ready for whatever challenges the day might bring. He was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, serving justice wherever it was needed most, being the kind of partner that every police officer hoped for and that every child in danger prayed would find them. 10. Final line. Leave a haunting image or emotional quote. 1 year later, the bronze statue was unveiled on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Zeus had first alerted to Harold Finch in the courthouse. The sculpture stood 8 feet tall in the center of Millbrook's renovated town square, depicting a German shepherd sitting at attention, his alert eyes gazing out over the community he had helped protect. The inscription at the base was simple, but profound. In memory of all the children who waited in darkness, and in honor of those who never stopped searching for the light. Sarah stood beside the statue with Zeus, now wearing the insignia of the Millbrook Police Department's K-9 unit commander. Around them, hundreds of community members had gathered for the dedication ceremony, including the 4 children whose rescue had inspired the memorial. Emma Rodriguez, now 8 years old and thriving, approached the statue with a wreath of flowers. As she placed it at the base of the memorial, she looked up at the bronze Zeus with an expression of solemn gratitude. "Thank you for listening when no one else could hear us," she whispered. The real Zeus, standing beside his bronze counterpart, tilted his head slightly, as if acknowledging the young girl's words. Then he did something that made everyone present fall silent with wonder. He walked to the statue, sat down in exactly the same position as his bronze likeness, and gazed out over the crowd with the same alert, protective expression captured in metal. For a moment, the living Zeus and his memorial reflection seemed to merge into a single symbol of loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bond between those who protect and those who need protection. In that moment, everyone present understood that some truths transcend the boundaries between species, between the living and the remembered, between hope and reality. Zeus had never barked again during a formal ceremony after that day in the courthouse, not because he couldn't, but because he had already spoken the only truth that mattered. Every child deserves to be found. Every voice deserves to be heard. And love is not love if it comes with locks and chains. The statue stood as a permanent reminder that sometimes justice comes not with sirens and handcuffs, but with the quiet loyalty of a partner who refuses to give up, who listens when others cannot hear, and who understands that the greatest victory is not in the capture of the guilty, but in the rescue of the innocent. Zeus had found his voice that day in the courthouse, and in finding it, he had given voice to every child who had ever waited in darkness for someone to find them. The bronze Zeus would stand guard over Millbrook forever, watching, waiting, ready to inspire others to listen.